They didn't let him die quickly. The frail bishop was strapped to a wooden windlass, a device never meant for mercy, only for horror. Torches flickered, casting jagged shadows on the faces of a silent crowd. A knife flashed. The executioner opened his abdomen with a single practiced cut. The bishop jolted, his prayer cut short, blood steaming in the cool night air. Then came the part no one in that square would ever forget. His intestines were drawn out, loop by loop, and hooked onto the crank of the windlass. A soldier grunted as he turned the handle. Slowly, impossibly slowly, Erasmus's very body was unwound, inch by inch in front of thousands of watching eyes. His scream tore through the night, raw, agonized, defiant. The governor raised a hand toward the crowd as if to say, "This is Rome's power, and this is what happens to those who refuse its gods." But to understand how this moment became legend, how a Christian bishop came to be disemboweled alive, as if he were nothing more than a warning carved into flesh, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when faith itself was enough to earn a death sentence. In the early 4th century, Christianity was still an underground faith, whispered in catacombs, carried in secret prayers, and punished with fire and steel. Emperor Diocletian, one of Rome's most feared rulers, had unleashed a wave of persecution so brutal that even hardened citizens recoiled. Churches were demolished, sacred texts burned, men, women, and children dragged into courts and forced to choose, bow to Rome's gods or die. For Bishop Erasmus of Formia, there was no choice. To renounce Christ was unthinkable. To hide was temporary. He knew the empire would come for him eventually. At first, Erasmus fled. He took to the wilderness of Mount Lebanon, where he lived as a fugitive for 7 long years. Imagine it, the bishop, once robed in dignity, now clothed in rags, surviving on roots and rainwater, praying by the light of hidden fire. Yet even in isolation, stories followed him. Stories that he had seen visions, that angels had spoken to him, urging him to return and shepherd his scattered flock. Whether true or legend, Erasmus emerged from those mountains transformed. He no longer feared Rome. His reappearance was like a spark in dry grass. Christians flocked to him, inspired by his defiance, comforted by his prayers. But his very presence drew danger like blood in the water. Roman soldiers seized him before long, chains biting his wrists as they dragged him before Diocletian himself. The emperor's demand was simple: sacrifice to the old gods, renounce this crucified Christ and live. Erasmus stood silent. Then he whispered a prayer. His refusal enraged the emperor, who believed fear could bend any man. So the tortures began. First came the scourging, whips tipped with lead balls that tore open his flesh until his back was nothing but ribbons. Witnesses said he bled so heavily the floor became slick beneath the soldiers' feet. Next came rods, breaking bones with each strike until the once proud bishop sagged like a puppet with cut strings. Then, in a crescendo of cruelty, they poured boiling oil and molten wax across his body, a punishment designed to cook him alive. The smell of seared flesh choked the onlookers. Many turned away, yet through it all, Erasmus did not scream, not once. When the oil cleared, he was still breathing, still alive, still praying. To the faithful, it was a miracle. To the Romans, it was an insult, a humiliation. Diocletian, frustrated, ordered him chained in a dungeon to starve. For weeks he was left in the dark, his body broken, his mind battered by thirst and hunger. But according to legend, one night the prison doors swung open on their own. Chains fell from his wrists. Erasmus walked out, free. It should have ended there. A man broken but alive, vanished into exile. But Erasmus did not run. Instead, he preached louder than before, moving from town to town, converting even more to the forbidden faith. Rome, furious, could not let him stand as a symbol of defiance, and so the cycle began again. Capture, torture, escape. Each time the empire tried to erase him, Erasmus returned, more unshakable than before. But history and cruelty would save its most nightmarish stage for last, because the Romans did not just want him dead, they wanted him destroyed in a way that no one could forget. They would craft a death so grotesque, so unforgettable, that even centuries later, people would still whisper about the man whose intestines were pulled out alive. And that brings us back to the square, to the waiting windlass, to the silent crowd holding its breath before the horror began. The second time they caught him, the Romans made sure everyone knew it. Erasmus was dragged through the streets like a wild animal, chains clanging against the stones. his bruised body paraded before jeering crowds. Soldiers spat at him. Children threw pebbles. But to the secret Christians who dared watch from shadowed doorways, his battered frame was not weakness. It was proof that Rome could not break him. This time, it was Emperor Maximian who took charge. Where Diocletian had failed to kill the bishop, Maximian would succeed. He had earned his reputation as one of the cruelest rulers in Roman history, a man who believed terror was the foundation of order, and Erasmus, an old defiant bishop who had already embarrassed the empire by surviving torture and prison, was now his personal insult. Maximian ordered something new. Erasmus was stuffed into a barrel lined with sharpened iron spikes. Soldiers shoved it to the top of a rocky hill. Crowds gathered, and with a single heave, the barrel began to roll. The sound was sickening, wood thudding against stone, metal grinding against flesh. Each bounce drove the spikes deeper into his body. Blood sprayed from the cracks, staining the rocks. By the time the barrel smashed against the ground below, the people expected silence. A mangled corpse. The end. But when the soldiers pried the barrel open, Erasmus was still alive. Barely breathing, drenched in his own blood, torn by 100 punctures, but alive. Some in the crowd gasped in awe. Others muttered that no man could endure such agony unless heaven itself protected him. To Maximian, this survival was not a miracle. It was an insult, a humiliation so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. Furious, the emperor threw Erasmus back into prison again. No elaborate tortures this time, just starvation. Weeks passed in the dark. He wasted to skin and bone, his prayers whispered into silence. Most thought the story would end there, a slow forgotten death. But legends say an angel came once more, breaking chains, guiding him into the night. Once again, Erasmus disappeared into freedom. By now, whispers about the bishop spread faster than soldiers could silence them. He wasn't just a preacher anymore. He was a myth. Towns spoke of miracles, a child restored to life after his blessing, food multiplying for the hungry, conversion spreading wherever he went. The Romans hunted him like a ghost, but he slipped through their nets, always reappearing to preach, always refusing to bow. The empire had crushed rebellions, enslaved nations, and executed thousands without hesitation. But Erasmus, one fragile old bishop, had become their greatest embarrassment. Each time he escaped, faith grew stronger. Each torture that failed became proof that Rome was not invincible. And so, Maximian's fury deepened into obsession. This man had to die, and not just die, he had to be unmade in a way that no Christian would dare forget. By 303 AD, the final order was given. Erasmus was to be captured once more, and this time no chains, no miracles, no mercy would intervene. Soldiers spread across towns and countryside, interrogating anyone suspected of harboring him. The bishop was finally seized after a long pursuit, his body frail, but his gaze still unwavering. Dragged before the provincial governor, Erasmus stood bloody and ragged, but he refused once again to renounce Christ. The court demanded he sacrifice to Jupiter, the god of Rome. Erasmus simply whispered a prayer. His defiance was like a dagger to the empire's pride. That was when Maximian devised the punishment that would become one of the most infamous in Christian legend, the torture by windlass, where a man's own body would be unwound before the eyes of the crowd. The device was prepared in the square, a massive wooden frame, a crank, a rope. Hooks gleamed in the torchlight, waiting for flesh. The crowd, half horrified and half hungry for spectacle, pressed closer. Many had seen men whipped, crucified, even burned alive. But this was something new, a methodical unmaking, the kind of horror people would whisper about long after the screams had faded. And in that moment, as Erasmus looked up at the night sky, chains cutting into his wrists, lips trembling in prayer, even his enemies must have wondered, how many more times could this frail old bishop defy death? And if he could not, what would Rome's vengeance look like when it finally had its way? The square was silent, the kind of silence that comes when even the wind seems to hold its breath. Only the sputtering of torches broke the stillness, their flames clawing at the night air. At the center, Erasmus stood bound to the wooden frame of the windlass, his robes already soaked with blood from earlier torments. His chest rose and fell in shallow breath. The crowd pressed closer, some clutching their children, others covering their mouths as if trying to stifle the dread that coiled in their stomachs. They had come for a spectacle, but what they were about to see would surpass even Rome's appetite for cruelty. The governor stepped forward, his face expressionless. He raised his hand, and the executioners moved into place. One carried a knife, long and sharp, glinting in the firelight. The other gripped the thick rope that wound around the windlass crank, waiting for the signal. Tell. Oh! A soldier pressed Erasmus against the wooden beam, pinning him so he could not move. For a moment, time stretched, then the knife slashed downward. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the blade tore into Erasmus' abdomen. His body convulsed, a strangled cry escaping his lips. Blood poured from the wound, warm and steaming in the night air. Yet even in the shock of agony, Erasmus whispered a prayer. His words trembled, but they did not break. The executioner reached inside, his hand slick with blood, and pulled free a length of intestine. For a heartbeat, the square froze. And then the murmurs began. Some onlookers turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned forward, transfixed by the unspeakable act they were witnessing. The rope was tied to the loose end of intestine, and with a grunt, the torturer began to crank. The rope tightened, and inch by inch, Erasmus' own body was unwound before their eyes. The crowd recoiled as his intestines stretched from the wound, glistening in the torchlight, slowly winding around the wooden spindle. Erasmus screamed, not a brief cry, but a deep, guttural wail that echoed across the square, searing itself into the memory of everyone who heard it. Some soldiers flinched at the sound. A few spectators vomited into the dirt, but the crank kept turning, slowly, methodically. This was no quick death. It was anatomy turned into theater, a man's insides pulled into the open while he remained conscious to witness his own destruction. The governor raised a statue of Jupiter, demanding that Erasmus renounce his god. A sacrifice, he barked. A bow, and this will end. Erasmus' face, pale and streaked with sweat, lifted toward the heavens. His teeth clenched, his lips cracked, but his voice carried. I will not. His defiance, spoken through the haze of agony, was more powerful than any scream. The crank turned again, more intestines unspooled, looping around the drum, slick and steaming in the torchlight. The bishop's body shook violently, yet he clung to consciousness, whispering fragments of prayer between cries of pain. The crowd was divided, half horrified, half compelled to keep watching. Some murmured that no mortal man could endure such torment without divine strength. Others whispered that Rome had finally gone too far, that cruelty had crossed into madness. Minutes passed like hours. Erasmus' face turned ashen, his eyes glassy but still alive. His blood pooled at his feet, soaking into the stones of the square. The windlass creaked with every turn, the sound of wood and rope mixing with his ragged breathing. The people had seen executions before, crucifixions, burnings, floggings, but this was different. This was systematic unmaking. A man turned into spectacle piece by piece. And then something strange happened. Witnesses claimed that in the midst of the agony, Erasmus lifted his head and his lips curled into a faint, almost serene smile. Some swore they saw a faint glow, as if angels hovered near, waiting to receive him. Others said it was delirium, the final spark of a mind slipping away. Whatever it was, it sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Was Rome destroying him or making him immortal? The governor, furious at his unbroken spirit, shouted for the crank to be turned faster. The executioners obeyed, their faces grim. Erasmus' scream tore through the night one final time before fading into silence, his head slumping forward, his body limp but still bound to the windlass. The square remained frozen. Even those who had come thirsting for blood now stood pale and trembling. They had witnessed not just a man's death, but a spectacle of such calculated cruelty that it seemed to stain the very air around them. Rome had silenced Erasmus' body, but in doing so, it had unleashed something far greater. When Erasmus finally slumped against the wooden frame, his body ruined by the windlass, the governor believed victory had been achieved. The crowd dispersed slowly, their faces pale, their stomachs churning. But in the silence of that night, something larger than Rome's cruelty was already taking shape. Erasmus, the bishop who had refused to renounce his god through years of torture, had not been erased. He had been immortalized. Word of his death spread quickly, carried by whispers, letters, and sermons. To Christians, he was no longer just a bishop. He was a martyr who had faced the worst that Rome could devise and refused to yield. His name began to circulate in secret gatherings, his story retold with trembling voices by candlelight. Parents told their children of the bishop whose intestines had been torn from him, but who never abandoned his faith. For the persecuted faithful, Erasmus became a symbol that no empire could extinguish. The Romans wanted his death to instill fear. Instead, it planted courage. Farmers, merchants, and laborers who had once hidden their faith now spoke of Erasmus as proof that endurance in the face of cruelty was not in vain. Even the method of his death, so horrific, so unprecedented, became a twisted kind of proof. If God had allowed Erasmus to endure such suffering, then surely his reward in heaven was greater than anything Rome could threaten. Legends multiplied. Some claimed angels were seen hovering above the square as Erasmus breathed his last, their wings catching the torchlight. Others swore they heard a strange stillness fall, as if nature itself paused to bear witness. These stories spread from town to town, gaining power with every retelling. In an empire that thrived on spectacle, Rome had inadvertently staged the greatest Christian performance of all, a demonstration not of Rome's strength, but of one man's unbreakable faith. Centuries later, sailors at sea would tell stories of Saint Elmo, their patron protector. They swore that when blue flames danced on their ship's masts during storms, a strange natural phenomenon now called Saint Elmo's fire, it was Erasmus watching over them. For men braving the black fury of the ocean, those flickering lights meant survival, courage, and divine presence. A martyr's agony had somehow transformed into a sailor's comfort. Historians, of course, debate the details. Did Rome really use the windlass to unravel a man's intestines in front of a crowd? Was this horror fact, or had the story been exaggerated by centuries of retelling? Skeptics point to gaps in Roman records, to the possibility of medieval embellishments meant to inspire fear and faith in equal measure. Perhaps Erasmus did die as many martyrs did, beaten, burned, starved, and the windlass tale was added later to magnify his legend. But others argue differently. Rome's reputation for inventive cruelty is well documented. From crucifixions to gladiatorial hunts, from molten metal executions to slow strangulations, the empire thrived on turning human agony into theater. Could the windlass have been one more device in their arsenal, used once and remembered forever? The silence of official Roman texts, they argue, might not be denial. It might be shame. A recognition that what they did to Erasmus was so monstrous, even they hesitated to write it down. What remains undeniable is the endurance of the story. For over 1,000 years, Erasmus' death has been painted in manuscripts, carved in cathedral walls, and whispered in prayers. His intestines stretched around a wooden spindle became more than a tale of cruelty. It became an emblem of defiance, a story that outlived the governors, the emperors, and even the empire itself. And that is the paradox Rome never understood. They believed cruelty could silence faith, that fear could control the human spirit. But the spectacle they created on that torchlit night achieved the opposite. Erasmus' death was not the end of his influence. It was the beginning of a legend that no sword, no flame, and no empire could destroy. Centuries have passed since the night Erasmus' body was unspooled before a horrified crowd, yet his story refuses to fade. In hushed churches, in sailors' prayers, in medieval manuscripts inked by trembling hands, the tale of the bishop whose intestines were wound around a wooden wheel endures. It is told as both warning and inspiration, as both history and legend, and in that duality lies its enduring power. Because when we strip away the layers of faith and myth, one terrifying truth remains. Rome did not invent cruelty, they perfected it. They understood that death itself was not enough. To control a population, to stamp out resistance, you had to make people see the consequences. Erasmus' death, whether fact in its full detail or a story magnified through centuries, embodies this philosophy. It was not execution, it was theater. A performance meant to burn itself into memory, and it worked. Not in the way Rome intended, but in a way no one could erase. Think about it. A frail old man in chains, refusing to bow, forced to endure horrors that defy imagination, becomes remembered not as a victim, but as a saint. The empire that sought to destroy him has crumbled into dust. But the story of his death, gruesome, haunting, unforgettable, still draws us in, still makes us ask questions about the nature of belief, the endurance of the human spirit, and the dark fascination humans have always had with suffering. Historians may argue over whether Erasmus' intestines were truly pulled from his body alive, whether the windlass device really existed, whether eyewitnesses embellished to shock or inspire. But in a way, that debate misses the point. Because whether or not every detail happened exactly as described, the story has already achieved what Rome could not: immortality. The martyr lives on, not in flesh and blood, but in legend, in art, in the whispered prayers of sailors staring at lightning on the horizon. And that is what unsettles us most. Because deep down, we realize the line between myth and reality is often thin, and cruelty is never just ancient history. The windlass, the wheel, the fire, these were Rome's tools. Today, humanity has invented new ones, more efficient, less visible, but driven by the same impulse to break bodies, to control minds, to make examples out of those who resist. Erasmus' story is not just about Rome's brutality. It is a mirror held up to our own time, reminding us that the machinery of cruelty always waits for those willing to turn the crank. So the next time you hear of Saint Elmo's fire dancing blue at the mast of a ship, think not only of divine protection, but of the man whose suffering gave that sign its name. A man who endured the unendurable, who defied the most powerful empire on earth, who became immortal through pain. Was he torn apart inch by inch before a screaming crowd? Was it faith that sustained him, or legend that grew larger than life? We may never know the full truth, but we know this: the story remains because we cannot look away, and maybe that's the real lesson of Erasmus' martyrdom. Not that cruelty destroys, but that cruelty remembered can transform into something the oppressors never intended: courage, defiance, and legend. The bishop's body may have been unraveled, but his story stitched itself into history forever. Rome believed they were ending him. Instead, they created something that no execution could silence.